You've probably heard the age of giant flying monsters ended the day an asteroid wiped out the pterosaurs. That's not the full story. The deadliest hunters in Earth's sky didn't disappear that day, they just changed shape, traded wings for legs, and somehow got even scarier. Today we're counting down the 8 deadliest predators to ever rule the skies, from a dragonfly the size of a hawk all the way up to something that made the ground feel smaller just by standing up on it. Let's get into it. And quick heads up, if you've ever gotten annoyed at a pigeon getting too close to your food at the park, you're about to feel very grateful for how far things have come down in scale. Alright, number 8. Meganeura. Rewind about 300 million years back to the Carboniferous period. Picture humid, oxygen-thick swamp forests, towering primitive trees packed into waterlogged thickets, the kind of place that would eventually get buried and compressed into the coal we're still mining today. That's the world Meganeura lived in, a predatory insect related to modern dragonflies, with a wingspan hitting roughly 75 centimeters. That's not a typo. 75 centimeters, about the same as a red-tailed hawk. Nothing in the sky at the time came close to it. For years, the go-to explanation for the size was oxygen, plain and simple. Carboniferous air sat around 35% oxygen, way higher than the 21% we breathe now. Insects don't have lungs. They absorb oxygen passively through a network of tiny tubes running straight through their bodies. So more oxygen in the air theoretically meant bigger bugs could survive without suffocating at their own core. But newer research complicates that a bit, because insects actually hit their peak size slightly after oxygen levels had already peaked. So there's probably a second ingredient here. There was simply nothing up there to stop them. No birds, no bats, no pterosaurs. Nothing with a backbone had figured out flight yet. So the sky above those swamps was just open. Zero competition, zero upper size limit. For as long as that emptiness lasted, Meganeura hunted the same way dragonflies do today, snatching other insects clean out of the air using spiny basket-like legs held out in front of it. Just picture that at a scale that would make a modern falconer take a step back. And for a good stretch of time, it got away with being the biggest thing in the sky simply because nothing existed yet that could challenge it. But Meganeura's reign couldn't last forever. Eventually, something with a backbone finally took to the sky, and the age of flying giants was about to begin. Number 7. Eudimorphodon. Fast forward about 70 million years and you land in the Triassic, the exact moment true flight shows up in a backboned animal for the very first time. That belongs to a group called pterosaurs, and they were about to own the sky, completely uncontested, for the next 150 million years. Birds hadn't evolved yet. Nobody was around to argue with them. One of the earliest known pterosaurs is Eudimorphodon, found along the coast of what's now Italy. Compared to what's coming later on this list, it's small, around a 1-meter wingspan. But don't let that fool you. Researchers found fish scales still sitting in its fossilized stomach at the moment it died, which tells you everything. This thing was already hunting, and hunting effectively, right out of the gate. No slow evolutionary warm-up lap required. Its teeth are genuinely interesting too. Instead of a single point like most later pterosaurs had, each tooth carried multiple little cusps, which usually points to a mixed diet, probably fish and insects both, meaning this animal was comfortable operating in 2 completely different hunting environments using one body plan, and structurally, it was doing something nothing on the planet had tried before, stretching a wing membrane off one dramatically elongated 4th finger. Bats solved flight differently. Birds solved it differently. Pterosaurs landed on this one specific strange solution and basically stuck with it for the rest of their 150 million year run, arrived at independently and apparently correctly on the first real attempt. Eudimorphodon proved that pterosaurs could hunt from the air, but a few million years later, their hunting techniques were about to become far more specialized. Number 6. Rhamphorhynchus. Jump ahead to the middle of the Jurassic, and pterosaurs had branched out in a dozen different directions. One of the standouts is Rhamphorhynchus, a long-tailed fisher with a mouthful of thin needle-like teeth angled forward and interlocking like a trap. It didn't need to land to eat. It could skim right across the surface of the water and snap its jaw shut the second it made contact, closing like a pair of pliers mid-motion. We know an unusual amount about how this animal actually lived thanks to where its fossils turn up. A limestone formation in Germany called Solnhofen. So fine-grained, it preserves details most fossils lose completely, right down to the texture of wing membranes. Some Rhamphorhynchus specimens have even been dug up with fish still lodged in their jaws, frozen mid-meal for around 150 million years. Not a lot of predators on this list have a photo finish that literal. There's also a rare growth series preserved here. Paleontologists have recovered Rhamphorhynchus specimens ranging from hatchlings all the way to full adults, with the largest known individuals reaching a wingspan of about 1.8 meters, letting researchers track exactly how its proportions shifted as it aged. Something you almost never get this cleanly in an animal this old. Its tail adds another odd detail: long, stiffened by thin bony rods and capped with a diamond-shaped vein of skin at the very tip, which most researchers think functioned like a rudder, stabilizing it during fast, low passes over water. And the skim-feeding picture itself isn't fully settled either. A widely cited 2007 biomechanical study argued that true skimming, dragging the lower jaw through water mid-flight, the way modern skimmer birds do, would have burned far too much energy for an animal this size to sustain for long. Rhamphorhynchus ruled the water's surface with a mouth built like a trap, but the next predator didn't need to skim the water at all. It could cross entire oceans. Number 5. Pelagornis sandersi. Jump way forward now, past the extinction of the dinosaurs and the pterosaurs both, into the Oligocene, out over open ocean. Pelagornis sandersi turned up near Charleston, South Carolina, discovered, weirdly enough, during construction work at an airport. Its wingspan is estimated somewhere between 5.5 and just over 6 meters, genuinely rivaling, maybe even beating, the biggest flying bird on this whole list, just built completely differently. Long and narrow, closer to an albatross, made for gliding efficiently over open water for as long as possible. The skeleton actually sat unstudied in a museum drawer for decades after its 1983 discovery, until paleontologist Daniel Schepker ran it through detailed flight modeling in a 2014 study, calculating the wingspan directly from the fossil's actual bone proportions rather than a rough visual estimate. What actually makes Pelagornis strange isn't just the size, it's the mouth. Running along both jaws are these sharp, tooth-shaped spikes that are made entirely of solid bone, fused permanently onto the jaw instead of sitting in individual sockets the way real teeth do. And that's genuinely bizarre because birds had already lost the genetic ability to grow actual teeth tens of millions of years before Pelagornis ever showed up, so this entire family basically reinvented teeth from raw bone just to solve the exact same problem their toothed ancestors had solved a completely different way tens of millions of years earlier. Those bony spikes worked perfectly for gripping slippery fish and squid snatched off the surface during flights that may have kept it airborne over open ocean for days at a stretch, barely touching land while it hunted. Quick pause before we keep climbing. If you're into randomly falling down prehistoric rabbit holes like this one, you know what to do. Back to the list. Pelagornis conquered the open ocean with wings built for endless gliding, but on land, another giant was about to push the limits of flight even further. Number 4. Argentavis magnificens. Head back over land into Miocene Argentina, roughly 6 million years ago, and you'll find Argentavis magnificens riding the air over open grassland with a wingspan pushing 7 meters, close to what you'd see on a small aircraft, and a body that may have weighed north of 70 kilograms. As far as the fossil record shows, that makes it the largest flying bird ever confirmed, a title it's held since it was first described back in the 1980s. Obviously, the first question anyone asks is how something that heavy ever got off the ground at all. Honest answer, it probably couldn't flap its way into the air the way an eagle can. It relied almost completely on soaring riding thermals, those columns of rising warm air, the exact same trick modern condors use, just scaled way up. Takeoff likely meant sprinting downhill or launching off an elevated perch, to catch rising air immediately because sustained flapping just wasn't really an option at this size. What it actually ate is still genuinely debated. Some researchers lean toward active hunting, small to mid-sized animals snatched right off the open grassland. Others think it was mostly a scavenger, soaring for hours while scanning huge stretches of terrain for carrion, which honestly fits a body that wasn't built for quick, aggressive maneuvering in the first place. Argentavis may have been the ultimate master of the air, but when the pterosaurs vanished, the next great predators wouldn't need wings at all. Number 3. Titanus walleri. 66 million years ago, the same asteroid that ended the dinosaurs also wiped every pterosaur off the planet in a single afternoon. Whatever filled that gap next wasn't going to fly at all. About 10 million years later, across South America, that role got taken over by the terror birds, officially the phorusrhacids, a whole family of flightless killers that ended up dominating their continent for tens of millions of years, basically doing the job lions and wolves do on every other continent. The family split into more than a dozen recognized species, and the biggest of them, Titanus walleri, stood up to 2.5 meters tall with a massive hooked beak that looked less like a modern eagle's and more like somebody had bolted a hatchet onto a bird's skull. For years, everybody assumed terror birds hunted the way eagles do, grip prey with the legs, wrestle it to the ground, deliver a killing bite. Reasonable assumption, but a biomechanical study of a terror bird skull using the same kind of stress modeling engineers use on actual buildings found the skull was rigid front to back, but surprisingly weak side to side. That's basically the opposite of what you'd want if the plan was grappling with something thrashing around underneath you. So the current theory is that terror birds killed with repeated, precise, hatchet-style strikes delivered from a distance, stunning or outright killing prey before it ever had a real chance to fight back, then tearing off manageable pieces rather than wrestling with anything. Less like a wrestler, more like something using its own head as a weapon and stepping straight back out of range the instant it landed the hit. For most of their history, terror birds had South America completely to themselves because the continent was geologically cut off for millions of years, with no large mammal predators around to compete with them. That changed about 3 million years ago when the Isthmus of Panama formed and physically connected the two continents, letting North American predators, including the early ancestors of modern cats and dogs, migrate south for the first time ever. That migration, on top of a shifting cooling climate, is generally considered one of the leading reasons the terror birds eventually died out. Here's the twist though. Titanus walleri didn't stay put in South America. Fossils of this exact species have turned up in Texas and Florida, meaning it made the reverse trip north across that same land bridge, becoming one of the only terror birds ever to set foot on North American soil. That timing also roughly lines up with early humans starting to spread out across other parts of the globe. So there's a real, if still actively debated, chance that early humans and a hatchet-beaked bird taller than most grown adults briefly shared the same stretch of land. The terror birds inherited the ground and turned their heads into weapons. But before their age even began, another giant was already waiting above them. Number 2. Hatzegopteryx tambema. Terror birds weren't the only giants stomping around after the pterosaurs went extinct, because right at the very end of the Cretaceous, before that asteroid ever hit, there was something almost as big as anything else on this list still airborne. Cross the old Tethys Ocean over to what's now Romania, and you land on Haseg Island, a landmass roughly the size of a modern Caribbean island, cut off from the mainland by open sea for millions of years. That's home to Hatzegopteryx tambema, a close relative of the animal taking the top spot, with a wingspan estimated between 10 and 12 meters, and a skull noticeably thicker and heavier than any other giant pterosaur on record. This wasn't built light for delicate fishing, it was built like it needed to survive taking a direct hit. The numbers behind that reinforced skull are wild on their own. Estimates put the skull alone at somewhere around 3 meters long, nearly as long as an entire adult human is tall, and unlike Quetzalcoatlus, its neck vertebrae are unusually short and thick rather than long and slender, more built for absorbing impact than for reach. Some mass estimates push it past 200 kilograms, noticeably heavier than you'd expect from an ajdarchid with a similar wingspan, which lines up with the idea that this animal was built to tackle prey other giant pterosaurs simply couldn't handle. Normally, islands shrink big animals down over time. It's a well-documented pattern called island dwarfism. Limited food, limited space, and large bodies just can't sustain themselves, so lineages shed size across generations to survive. Hartseg Island's dinosaurs followed that rule to the letter, including sauropods that shrank down to something closer to the size of a large horse instead of anything resembling their continental cousins. Hartsegopteryx did the exact opposite. With no large predatory dinosaurs around to compete with, it grew into the apex predator of the entire island instead, hunting those same dwarfed dinosaurs from the air with a skull built for crushing rather than the lighter, more delicate fishing bite typical of its mainland relatives. The dwarfing pattern around it is just as extreme as the skull. Hartseg Island itself is estimated to have covered somewhere in the neighborhood of 80,000 square kilometers, and its most famous resident, a sauropod called Magyarosaurus dacus, shrank down to around 6 meters long and maybe 500 to 900 kilograms, a fraction of the 20-plus tons its mainland titanosaur relatives could reach. That comparison isn't new either. It was first proposed all the way back in the early 1900s by paleontologist Franz Nopcsa, a genuinely strange historical figure, a Transylvanian baron who financed his own digs on the island and was the first person to formally connect the island's shrunken dinosaurs to limited resources decades before island dwarfism became an accepted, well-studied phenomenon in evolutionary biology. One island, one set of biological rules, and one predator that simply decided none of it applied to it. Hartsegopteryx was enormous, heavily built, and terrifyingly well-armed. But even it wasn't the biggest thing ever to leave the ground. Number 1. Quetzalcoatlus northropi, and here it is, the deadliest thing that ever learned to leave the ground. Quetzalcoatlus northropi was first described from remains found in Texas back in the 1970s, but we didn't really understand what we were looking at until an exhaustive monograph was published in 2021, the product of decades of careful work across multiple research teams. The final numbers, a wingspan somewhere between 10 and 11 meters, roughly the wingspan of a small fighter jet, while standing tall enough on the ground to look straight into a second-story window. Giraffe height, except this giraffe could fly. Here's the detail that overturns pretty much every documentary you grew up watching. Quetzalcoatlus almost certainly wasn't some graceful swooping predator skimming fish off a lake surface. That 2021 reassessment points to something much stranger, a primarily terrestrial hunter stalking across open Cretaceous floodplains on all fours, using a long, rigid neck and a spear-like beak to snatch up small dinosaurs, lizards, and other ground-dwelling prey. Essentially, a giant flying stork that, most of the time, would rather just walk. Even getting off the ground wasn't graceful. Based on biomechanical modeling of its skeleton, it likely launched with a running vault off all four limbs at once, using its powerful forelimbs the way a pole vaulter uses a pole, catapulting itself upward before its wings ever fully engaged. Nothing alive today takes off anything like that. Picture something this size crossing your field of view. It wouldn't look like a bird passing overhead. It would look like a piece of the landscape that decided on a whim to stand up and start walking toward you, casting real shade across the ground the whole way. That's the deadliest thing to ever rule the sky. And honestly, the ground too, whenever it felt like it. So that's the full countdown. We started with a dragonfly the size of a hawk, ruling an empty, oxygen-soaked sky with zero competition, worked through the very first fish-eating pterosaur, proving flight worked on the first real attempt, a needle-toothed fisher caught mid-meal in stone for 150 million years, an ocean wanderer that grew its own teeth back out of solid bone, a bird possibly too heavy to even flap its own wings, a hatchet-beaked killer that took over an entire continent once the sky went quiet, an island giant that grew bigger, while everything around it shrank. And finally, a giraffe-sized stalker that basically rewrote what flying was supposed to look like in the first place. Every single animal on this list eventually lost its crown to something the world hadn't seen coming yet. New competition, new prey, a planet that kept changing shape underneath it, and every one of them, in its own moment, genuinely thought it had the sky or the ground figured out for good. So, if you had to face just one of these things, in the air or on the ground, which one do you think you'd actually see coming in time? Let me know in the comments.